for how long?
Well, we're live now, so I'll humor everyone for a few minutes whilst you go and get out of some water, which is perfectly fine.
I can make this last for a little bit of time. So
are you sure? All right. Well, hi everyone to this live stream with someone new. We've done quite a few exciting live streams between sort of YouTube and of course Substack, as some of you know. I've seen the value and great communities that exist on Substack, so we're doing more there as well. And someone who was kind enough to respond to my curiosity, mainly because I've been speaking to him, reading much of his work for a while now, is Tim Mack. Tim, you are in Kyiv, I think, right? Or somewhere in Ukraine.
Right,
yeah. And no, go ahead, please.
Oh yeah, I'm based in Kyiv. I run a Substack publication called The Counteroffensive, which you can check out at counteroffensive.news. And we cover human interest stories. What we do is we, instead of reporting on the news as a series of this happened, this happened, this happened, we introduce you to a person who went through the news story. And by getting to know that person a little bit better, you get to understand the news a little bit more deeply.
Yeah, so it's a sort of people-centric, story-centric approach to covering contemporary events, I guess you could say, or sort of like a storytelling method of news, so to speak. Yeah, and I guess like there's quite a few things I'm very curious to get your take on over the next period of time. But one of the first things really is just how is it out there at the moment for regular viewers of the channel or readers? They'll know that yesterday was one of Moscow's largest attacks in a while across much of the capital. There's been significant strikes. And of course, this is all in the context of the growing strikes across Russia from Ukraine and Crimea, which we'll come to as well, looking very precarious. So, yeah, just take us through sort of how things are out there for you right now and what it feels like to be on the ground, so to speak.
Well, so a lot of people think that, you know, I'm dodging mortar shells on the way to the coffee shop in the morning, but there is actually a tempo and a cycle to the violence that visits Kyiv. During the day, usually there are not that many attacks, but it's when the night falls, the sun sets, and the air alarms start that you get this familiar rhythm and this familiar sound of drones in the air, anti-aircraft fire, missiles incoming, and interceptors being shot to try to shoot some of these things down. And it's become this cycle. So it might make you feel a little weird if you were here at, say, 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Kyiv, because it might look like pretty much a lot of other Eastern European cities. It's at night when the strikes usually occur, and the whole environment changes. It seems.
Yes, I've been a few times during the past few years, and at least in the initial part of the war, shall we say, there's different phases, I think one could argue, but at least in that initial period before things stabilized, the situation would not have been as it is now. The the rate of change and normalcy, you could say, that has developed around parts of the capital and other cities is quite remarkable. And I guess, like, how long have you been out there actually, just for clarity?
So I've been in Ukraine in one way or form for the last 4 years or so, more than 4 years.
Oh wow! So you've been there the entire time.
Yeah. So basically, what happened is, you know, I've got a background that's both journalism and military. So I spent time in the U.S. Army. I also spent a large part of my career working in Washington, D.C., covering national security for places like Politico, The Daily Beast, and NPR, the American public broadcaster. And in 2022, NPR sent me to Kyiv in case a war might break out. And as it happened, I landed the night the invasion began. And I've been here pretty much ever since. I started my own company in Ukraine in 2023, and it's been growing. It's called the Counteroffensive, and you know, here I am all these years later.
Wow, I see. No, I was curious of what the how you'd developed the company, the publication. I want to make sure I describe it accurately, because it's it's a very important, I think, outlet for providing that unique perspective as you laid out in the initial. But just to bring it to sort of contemporary events a little bit,
Sure.
what's your perspective on the campaigns by both the Ukrainians and the Russians? Because from my understanding, the Russians have now admitted, Putin admitted, I think in the past 24 hours, that Ukraine used its first ever ballistic missile. If that's true, what do you think that means?
Well, I would move away from tactics and into strategy, right? So, in my opinion, it's much more important to understand the ways in which Ukraine is creating restrictions on the Russian economy, the way that it's constraining Russian oil refining capability, the way that it's making people in Russia feel the pain for this war that they've been the pain of which has been absent for a very large portion of this war. So that actually occurring is far more important than any particular weapon being utilized. Now, Ukraine has been able to develop all sorts of technological capabilities that it didn't have 4 years ago, including mid and long range strike drones and missiles that are now able to hit targets far, far away from the front lines. And we're seeing an incredible explosion. Well, maybe not the right word, an incredible proliferation in the kinds of technologies that are being used on the battlefield right now, and a lot of really interesting innovation as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think since this is the first time we've done something together, but I hope the first of many. For my context, I cover a lot the relationship between Russia and Europe, NATO, because I come from both sides of this matter. My father's from Moscow, and my mum's from Brighton, actually, in London, in the UK. So there's this mixture of trying to understand the psyche, and what I think is remarkable is the innovation that the Ukrainians have demonstrated, despite being in full-time war, their capacity to innovate, but also advise the likes of, say, the Gulf states in the past few months over the war in Iran, let alone, of course, now even I think there's been some suggestions they're advising parts of the US military or DOD or DOW now, and such. So I'm just kind of curious, as someone on the ground, when you're speaking to your compatriots or counterparts in military matters and journalism, what are you hearing most often? Is it a sense of long-termism, like they have a long-term plan of what they plan to develop, or is it more they have to react and sort of develop things on the fly because of more needs-based, I guess I'd say?
Yeah, when people talk to me about Ukrainian defense technology, what I try to stress is not to get hung up on any particular product, but instead to think about the process of innovation that led to all these kinds of new defense technologies. And the way that happened was that instead of through a centralized kind of government-led process, the Ukrainian military early in the war decided to push down a lot of decisions for procurement and engineering down to local levels, to local commanders, the brigade and battalion levels. And what that led to was a huge increase in the number of defense technology companies and startups that emerged onto the battlefield. Now, Ukraine had a really, really developed IT sector before the full-scale invasion started. A lot of the people, the founders, the innovators, the engineers, those types shifted into the defense technology sphere and then started working to build weapons of war. I mean, one of my favorite examples is a company that was originally started to create video cameras so that you watch your cat while you're away at work. Isn't that cute? They switched to making optics for killer drones, right? And so this has happened in hundreds of different companies and thousands of different engineers and innovators who are then going on to build really interesting technology that is able to punch above its weight, right? What's interesting about Ukraine's defense is not merely that they've been able to hold the line in many cases, is that they've been able to hold the line despite the fact that they're so much smaller from a population perspective, have so fewer resources, and have a much smaller economy than Russia does. the way that it does that is because it's been able to out innovate and create some technologies to really push back against Russia in an outsized way.
Certainly. But I mean, to be devil's advocate, because we try to diversify some of the opinions we have on the show, because I think it's important to engage, not simply dismiss. Otherwise, you never can challenge what's said. But to be devil's advocate, but wouldn't you say that that's because of the amount of funding that they get from NATO? If it weren't for foreign funding and input advice from, I don't know, the British have been on the ground, let's be honest, we know that, and have been giving political input and things like that. So do you think the Ukrainians would have been able to do that without such external input?
Of course, Ukraine would have struggled a lot more if it didn't have aid from its partners in the West. Obviously, javelins early in the war, obviously ATACMS from the United States, obviously Patriot interceptors have been critical to the defense of Ukraine. There's no doubt about it. But I think what Ukrainians have been able to show is that they've been able to, despite their resource constraints, also develop their own technologies. I mean, you may remember in 2022, we were talking about artillery shells constantly. Yeah. Everyone was talking about artillery shells. How many artillery shells can we fire? How many artillery shells can we get? Well, now 80% of the injuries and fatalities caused on the front lines to Russian troops are drone-related strikes, not artillery. So how did that happen? That didn't happen merely because outside forces developed drone technology. In fact, the Ukrainians have been at the forefront of developing those technologies, not the Americans, which, as we've seen in the Iran war, are still quite far behind in both drone and counter-drone technology. It's the Ukrainians that have led the way because they've been constrained, but they've been motivated to build new things, and that would be my argument. I don't think anyone is trying to dismiss the contributions of allies to the Ukrainian war effort. It would be much, much more difficult if there weren't funding, humanitarian support, military aid. But the Ukrainians have been able. The Ukrainians are the ones fighting and dying, and they've been able to hold their own despite overwhelming odds.
No, certainly. And to reiterate, I ask these questions not because one stands by them, but because inevitably some people will claim, well, this is a proxy war and therefore Ukraine's not really doing it. It's on its own. It's actually Russia versus NATO. That kind of narrative talk. So I think it's important to then put it towards people who can say, well, that's completely debunked because of X, Y, and Z, as you've just very clearly done. But obviously one thing comes to mind, someone I think unintentionally put it in the comments, but rightly said, is the Flamingo missile, right? This is an incredible piece of tech, which I think has, and the drone interceptors themselves just in the past few months with what they've been doing and advising the Emiratis, the Saudis. This is significant military capacity, which shows you that Ukraine is going to be ahead of the curve for a long time. You don't need big, established, heavy-duty military equipment to yield effective results, right?
Well, I think what it shows is the complexity of modern warfare, which involves a lot of layers. And I think the American war on Iran really illustrates a lot of these layers. That the United States, no one will dispute that the United States is the most capable air force in the entire world. But there is a limit to what you can achieve through this kind of strategic bombing. And there's also a vulnerability if you're not able to counter the enemy's drone technology, the Shaheeds the Iran's fired, the missiles that Iran fired. And what we saw was that the United States was lacking in a lot of these other kinds of aspects of warfare, because warfare is evolving extremely, extremely quickly due to iteration on the front lines, due to innovation on the part of both the Ukrainians and, by the way, the Russians and Iranians. You cannot dismiss the Russians or Iranians as backwards or not innovative. They've been following along very closely, and they've been adapting to modern warfare as well. And I guess what I'm saying is that there are many different layers. One layer involves relatively cheap, small Type 1 drones of the kind that you've seen with these little rotors that are about this big that can go and act in a kamikaze drone fashion. Bigger drones, bomber drones, even long mid-strike drones that are now attacking logistics convoys in occupied southern Ukraine. Long-range drones, which are these flamingos that we've been talking about. So there are so many different levels to the technology. Ukraine has been able to make itself an expert in quite a number of these levels, particularly the kind of so-called cheap tech that is that punches above its weight.
It does, and one thing I want to get into specifically with you is a little bit about Crimea. Now, we had an interesting podcast with a lady yesterday. Her name is Emma Salisbury of the Foreign Research Policy Institute in Europe, I think in Berlin. She's maritime expert. And so we were looking at the Black Sea. Not that much has changed there in the past few months. Ukraine largely has, made the Russians even flee Sevastopol. But what I thought was interesting was putting it in the context of recent developments around Crimea. And of course, Kerch Bridge being severely degraded and a lot of Russians fleeing to mainland Russia and obviously being blocked because of Ukrainians' drone input. Take me through what you're seeing down there. I believe you wrote a piece about this on June 25th. So how have things changed down there? And generally, what is the lay of the land around Crimea? How bad is it?
Well, I think that what you are observing right now is a logistics targeting strategy, right? That what you're seeing in Crimea is that it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to get gasoline. Well, what does that mean? That means shops stop running. That means the power goes out in a lot of cases. That means the tourism sector, which is critical to the Russian occupation of Crimea, that's totally collapsed. And it's making people who are occupying this territory feel the pain in a way that the Ukrainians, by the way, have been feeling for the last 4+ years. And the way they're doing it is a combination of factors, including naval drones in the Black Sea and mid-range strike drones that are attacking convoys moving along this so-called land bridge that connects mainland Russia to Crimea.
Yeah, no, certainly. But just to dig a little bit further in that, like, can you take me through some of the tactical level means by which they're doing so? Because this is a mixture of a geopolitical and economic podcast that we look at conflict and military affairs more at the strategic level. But I am quite curious, when you're looking at this on a daily basis, what are the tactics? How are Ukrainian, how is the AFU, excuse me, out maneuvering the Russians?
Well, they're using a number of these mid-strike drones. There are some of these. So Firepoint, which is a company that creates the Flamingo, they have these long-range UAVs called the FP1 and the FP2. There are other types of drones being used, like the US-made Hornet. That's by a company called Perennial Autonomy. So these mid-strike drones are now being produced at real scale, and these drones are being used to target almost exclusively logistics and creating this squeeze in gas, electricity, and other essential supplies for troops and people who are in the Crimea area. And then from the naval perspective, what we've seen is naval drones being able to decimate and reduce the capability or damage or destroy about 30% of the Russian Black Sea fleet through, even though Ukraine doesn't really have, prior to the full-scale invasion in 2022, didn't really have a navy to speak of. I'm sure I might upset a couple naval officers out there, but it didn't really have a substantial navy prior to the full-scale invasion, and it's been able to really hold its own despite that fact.
But I think that, well, upset or not, I think it's an astute point, right? Because it's true that the Ukrainians are leveraging drones and hybrid warfare. I think the term is a little bit oversaturated now, but asymmetrical means by which to overpower or outmaneuver a much more conventional military force. I mean, one could also argue that the primary naval assets of the Russians are in the north, not really in the Black Sea, but that's besides the point. Sevastopol is significantly, it's a centerpiece to their southern flank, to their Mediterranean and European interests. And so for that to have been, for them to have scarpered from it is a huge deal. But I'm quite
this is kind of a point that really underscores the lack of reality around this whole, like, this is a Russia versus NATO fight. Is that there's a genuine and real spirit of Russia. There's a genuine and real spirit of Ukrainian resistance to Russian occupation, almost everywhere that you go, and that even if, assuming that it was merely sort of a proxy war where the West is funding Ukraine, none of it would occur unless Ukraine had hundreds of thousands of people willing to fight on its behalf, willing to build things for the war effort, willing to respect the honored war dead, and so on and so forth. I think it's just, it doesn't match with reality, what we're seeing on the ground with some of these wild theories that Ukraine is being used as some sort of tool for Western interests.
No, I think it's, and always have thought it's pretty preposterous. I think it gives a great degree of insult to a huge proportion of people who somehow apparently have no agency. Apparently Ukrainians are just sort of willing to sit back and allow the GRU and the security services just to sort of roll on in. I mean, that's one of the biggest, I don't know, tell me if you agree or not, Tim, but one of the biggest misconceptions by the Kremlin was that they didn't even need to send in the actual military. When the initial full-scale invasion occurred on the 24th, they sent in the security services as a way to secure specific outposts, checkpoints, and assume that just by being on the ground, they would be welcomed with open arms by the Ukrainians, literally as liberators. And then they would sort of send in the conventional military forces to sort of clean up or stabilize, et cetera, et cetera. And that was obviously not the case. But that was what Putin genuinely believed and still believes, clearly, based on the piece that he's written, but even in his comments now, regardless of what he says, about the limitations of Russia's whatever, or the economy facing, I want to dig into that with you in a moment. He clearly still ideologically believes that what he is doing is the right thing.
There's a key insight here to what you just said, and I think let's tease it out here before we move to the next issue, because Putin either made a terrible misjudgment about the nature of Ukraine itself, or made that judgment based on very, very poor information about the nature of Ukraine, right? And I think the lesson to be learned, to be extracted for today and tomorrow and the next year, is that Putin is still likely getting very poor information about the situation in Ukraine, is getting very poor information about the Russian economy. Autocrats generally get very poor information because people around them are convinced they're going to be arrested or fired or killed because they're delivering bad news. And so Putin, from what I can tell, is getting the minimum sliver of truth in his reports, whereas that's a poor basis for making decisions. He's constantly being fed information that's rosier about the battlefield conditions than it actually is. The Russian government has consistently stopped providing public economic data in areas where it doesn't suit them. So it gives you a sense of the mindset of an autocrat and how you can make bad decisions or foolish decisions just because of poor information incoming.
No, I mean, I know some people watching may have wanted to come from a military conversation, so we don't have to focus too much on the Russian side for a second. But that's what we do. That's being from this unique background. That's what I try to leverage when I talk about it, because I think it gives me a slightly different perspective. You could be a Westerner and talk about Russia, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have the mindset or a relationship to it in that way. And you could be a Russian and denounce the West, but if you don't live in the West, so I think that's what I try to strip back when I talk about it. And just on the Putin point, to me, he goes through several phases, ever since he took power in 99, after the Chechen wars, after Georgia, after the Crimean annexation, lots of different phases, let alone politically with the Snow Revolution or other moments of political disturbance that he's had to deal with. He's changed in his mindset. And I think after COVID, he's become a lot more paranoid. We can see this even now. He increased his security detail last week from about 750 to about 800 and something. So a 10% increase of security. Just that's his personal security detail.
Yeah.
Everyone, not like a couple. It's 800 people for one guy. It shows you how paranoid he is, and that he's losing the plot a little bit, or losing control of the situation. And he is the pin-up strongman. He is the original strongman that people like Lukashenko or Bolsonaro or others have looked to, Orban, as a sort of, oh, can I replicate that in some way? And what I think a lot of people believe Trump wants to replicate. You know, we've had guests like Mark Galliotti on, or Anne Appleby I've hosted before. And, you know, they say that exactly what you said about strongman autocrats. It's a very similar pattern after a while in terms of how they behave, what motivates them, and things like that. But yeah, I mean, that just what comes to mind. I don't know if you've got anything else you wanted to add. Otherwise,
so someone mentioned in the comments that I love engaging with your commenters and our comments. So someone said, what that I'm engaged in some excuse making for Putin. I think what I'm actually doing is trying to settle in on what the nature of autocracy is. As someone said, Putin lacks curiosity. Why are you making that sort of excuse for him? Autocrats are allergic to curiosity because they lack the humility that is necessary to be curious about matters. They have this sort of arrogance about information, and they want and they create a culture of fear around them, so that people are not incentivized to provide them true information. So that I think is the nature of authoritarianism and the culture that it proliferates.
Oh, certainly. No, it goes without question that Putin has been micromanaging this war for many months at this point, a couple of years. Most people agree with that. But it's also got to the point where he's managing the economy, right? His own central bank, a governor of the central bank, Nibulina, can never get her right name. She has been out of the picture for a couple of weeks. I mean, most people agree it was probably a illness, but she has never been in Putin's inner circle, the Slaviki, right? She's never been in that. What she has been is a great autocrat, technocrat at managing the economy, doing what needs to be done, just being a great economist. And whether you like her or not, you have to respect that she's done wonders with something which is frankly on its last legs. But even she's being phased out, from what I understand of colleagues of mine, friends, contacts, whatever, in Russia, because she is saying we literally have nowhere to move with this now, and Putin can't handle that. When he goes, I think the other thing about Putin, he has a couple of tells, to me at least. When he disappears, he's in panic mode, or when he goes quiet. If he doesn't say anything or just ignores the question, he doesn't have an answer. He doesn't know what to do. He's uncomfortable. His back's up against the wall. And the fact that he finally had to say something, and this is sort of where I wanted to lead the conversation anyway, Tim, on Monday, admitting, and this is what I think is also crucial about the context. Putin said this to a team of United Russia staff, right? I don't know if you were following this very much, or viewers were following this, but keep in mind, Putin won his first election under the United Russia banner. But ever since, I think, 2006, 2008, I can't remember which year it was, he's run as an independent or unassociated with United Russia. However, this time, he actually came out and was saying stuff, and there was an official statement by the Kremlin in association with the United Russia Party, which seems to me and some other onlookers like he's trying to sort of consolidate his position and sort of shift the blame a little bit away from just Putin to sort of, well, it's the party, guys, it's not me, which is very interesting. Again, a sort of another deployment of distraction or whatever, sleight of hand sort of thing. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Tim.
Well, I don't know. When you have this, when you build your image as this powerful autocrat, it's very difficult to then shift the blame to other people, right? You got to take the good with the bad, and I think people understand at a much more fundamental level than politics what leadership is.
Yeah.
When people are leading, they take accountability for their mistakes. Those are the kinds of people you want to follow. Forget whether you're in an authoritarian system or a democratic system. I think it's our nature to admire people who are able to respond to adversity by acknowledging errors and developing a solution to fix them. But autocrats are constitutionally unable to do that. And so now he's trying to spread the blame. But, I don't know how anyone could buy that after years of hearing about this very powerful central government led by Vladimir Putin, how the Russian people could possibly sort of think, oh, well, everything good that happened, we can credit to Putin, and all of our suffering, that's United Russia or some other organ of the government.
Yeah, and I'm just curious, I guess, for someone on the ground there, as long as you have been, what is the general sentiment amongst Ukrainians that you speak to about the situation? A lot of people argue that if Russia just ends this war tomorrow, then it will stop. But I feel that the generational impact this has had on Ukrainians' views of Russians and others is very difficult. It's quite entrenched. How do you feel about that? And what would you say is the likely step moving forward?
I think there are two kind of related questions there, right? So the first is, if Russia stopped the war tomorrow, would the war end? I think that's absolutely true. I think a lot of Ukrainians don't want to be involved in a war at all. I mean, they're involved in a war merely because they want their nation to survive. So if Russia were to stop and withdraw, I think the war would end tomorrow. But when you talk about the generational impact on this, I think it's very much true. I mean, just a few years ago, most young people in Ukraine were watching Russian television shows and comedy and following Russian movie stars, and the war has created a real a lasting and generational fissure between these two countries, and that's not going to be fixed in any short order of time. It's not really a coincidence either, right? That when a country led by an autocrat invades your country and says your culture, people, language ought not to exist, that you might think, well, this might be a good time for me to double down and preserve my culture, my people, and my identity, right? And language. And that is what is happening. You see this in society of an increasing shift towards Ukrainian and away from Russian, although there are still plenty of Russian language speakers in Ukraine. And that's just one of the many signals of the social expectations in Ukraine. I mean, to really drill down, I mean, if you go on if you're a Russian speaking person on Tinder in Kyiv, you're going to find it very hard to get a date as opposed to a Ukrainian speaking person, right? Because many young people don't want to date Russian speakers or people who predominantly speak in Russian, because it kind of signifies something about their values, whether that's fair or not. Because I mean, I think the alternate point is, of course, that there are many, many Russian-speaking Ukrainian soldiers that are fighting and dying for the existence of the Ukrainian nation. So, but it is a topic of discussion and debate and contest in this society, and you can see that it will not stop after the war is over.
No, it won't. I put out a video yesterday talking about the historical parallels. I think about this a lot because as a Russian observer, I find that I keep coming back to one particular moment, which is Petrograd. Otherwise, in 1917, when Nicholas was ousted. He was the leader of a country that was in disarray and eventually disposed of. And he is what Putin does now, to me, gives me a lot of sentiments of the same, that he is in denial. He is denouncing everything that Ukraine does, but increasingly his options are really running out. And I think another good example of this, there is, I forget the name of the company, I think it was in the Moscow Times, if people read that a few days back, no, but a couple of weeks ago now. But basically they took about 7 billion from one of Russia's largest oligarchs. And the point is that, excuse me, this is going to start happening more and more. The Kremlin is actually literally just going to start seizing assets from the elites, which, if you're doing that, the one thing that Putin has banked on, his entire system is based on having the elites and his inner circle satisfied, right? And if he's going to start doing that, then one really has to question how tenable his position is. And it makes me think about sort of Nicholas and the Romanovs and their final days, because he was so out of touch with the average Russian citizen. It led to the eventual dissolution. And I think, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but history has taught us that the only time Russia seems to go through significant change, societal change, is revolution. In 1990, in 1991, or systemic moments of change like that. So I guess I wonder sort of, no, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm curious to get your view on this. I was speaking recently with the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, and he was telling me about a theory that he and other Russian observers have about the nature of Russian identity itself, and how wrapped up it is in this notion that being Russian is to be able to suffer and endure suffering, and that the kind of suffering, economic suffering, military suffering that we've seen in Russia in over the last few years, that's the kind of suffering that would bring many other countries to its knees and to the negotiating table. But Russians have a different way of thinking about it, and it's embedded in their own way of thinking about themselves. And I wonder if you think there's any truth to that idea.
I will answer that in a second, but someone was asking me about it. So this is the article I was talking about. So they've confiscated $7.6 billion in assets in the largest nationalization. So this gentleman is Vadim Moshkovich, who is linked to, which company is he linked to? Can't find the name of it. Rusagro. Rusagro. Yeah, I mean, I am half Russian, but my pronunciations are not great. So sorry, anyone, for watching if I butchered that. But yeah, so that's the story. But we're going to see more of that happening, I think. In terms of your question, no, I appreciate it. I can say from my own experience, yes, because unfortunately, a large proportion of my family have this sentiment, which is, I mean, I'll be more specific. So my father's side, his grandmother is Don Cossack. So she comes, or her lineage comes from the Donbass, ironically. So I have heritage, which is in the Donbass. But the complexity of this is that at the time, it was under the Imperial Russia. So this is where you might have heard the term Novorossiya mentioned, or New Russia. This was conquered in the 1700s under Katarina the Great, or Catherine the Great, which is much of the south and west, southern and eastern parts of Ukraine. So from Luhansk, Donetsk, all the way down to Odessa. So this is why the Russians claim that Odessa is Russian, when it's obviously a lot more complicated and, well, much more Ukrainian than Russia, let's be honest, over history. So in this regard, this shows you how intertwined the two countries are in history for that. And so where the West or Western influences, or the idea of Western liberal thought, if you like, has influenced the Ukrainians more over time, it hasn't done so to such an extent in Russia. It did in the liberal elite classes in, say, the Enlightenment, you know, in St. Petersburg, in arts, like with I don't know, Pushkin or Tchaikovsky or something like that. But in a general sense, I think a lot of Russians look at the war within Ukraine as a broader struggle against the West. They do. I think that this is a sense of Putin's own manipulation in the past few years, but that manipulation is built on decades of other propaganda and psychological influence from the Soviets and from the Cold War. and even you can go even further than that, that the idea of not 1 inch further east, right? There is this idea and emphasis about NATO that, Secretary James Baker in the 90s promised the Russians that there wouldn't be another expansion of NATO, when what he was talking about was simply that it wouldn't be around Germany. And it was never a written joint declaration. It was just a sort of a verbal commitment to potentially exploring it later. It's these sorts of deliberate miscommunications or murkiness of the past, which I think leaves a lot of Russians feeling lied to or manipulated. But it's not always that true. There is a general insecurity, I think, about a lot of Russians about the encroachment of NATO around the southern and western flank. And therefore it leads to the Russian psyche of sort of, well, we have to survive, we have to endure. To quote one guest we had on a few months back, Sarah Payne, Russians are professional sufferers, right? They are, but I think that's quite typical of a lot of Serbs. You could say have similar sentiments sometimes after the Yugoslav wars. So I do think that there is this sort of hardship that exists under the sort of the Russian psyche quite a lot, which is sad.
Pride and heart in particular, and
pride as well. Yes, the national pride, and
the more you're squeezed, the more you're doing what you ought to be doing as part of your core identity, I guess.
And I think it's also being invaded twice, like Napoleon, Operation Barbarossa, now NATO. There are these feelings amongst Russians because the Great Plains in Poland and Eastern Europe is so flat. The Russians are incredibly paranoid that you're going to see some massive land army just walking all the way to Moscow again, even though that's why they focus so much on their land army and never really partook in the scramble for Africa or something like that. Anyway, I said a lot there, so I'll stop talking. I was meant to be interviewing you anyway. We're
gonna have a conversation too. I'm happy with the conversation as well.
No, it's difficult to articulate in a brief moment because there's so much complexity here. There's so much depth, and I think it's frustrating when you get people who don't understand the nuances of it. Not defending any one side or something like that, but it's like you really have to understand the history. You really have to understand the geographical elements.
The answer to that question on Russian identity, I think, is the core of the most central issue that it faces us now, which is when will this war end?
Of course, always.
The answer to the question of how long this Russian war effort will continue depends on how much Russian society will endure suffering. So I think it's the most fundamental question to anything we want to learn about the Russo-Ukrainian war, because at the core of it lies the most important detail.
No, I mean, it was Clausewitz that said war is but policy by other means, right? And until policies within home change, domestic politics, until we see a substantive... people talk about the re-education or re-engineering of society in Russia or in Iran even, right? What will it take to engineer a genuine overthrow of an autocratic system? Forget just Putin, for example. We could talk about any system. Mm-hmm. Well, that has to come from within. But the idea of sort of supporting an armed revolution, we're not really in those days anymore. Information warfare is very effective with the illustration and existence of the internet. It's much harder to over, as we've seen with America's attempts over the IRGC and Islamic Republic. So from Russia, look, I think we have to be also... We have to manage expectations. Russia's not going to be part of the West. I have this naive desire that one day Russia could be part of the West, right? Or it could be more westernized. Can it be more constructive partner? Yes. But I don't think we should imagine waking up one day and Moscow is sort of like London, right? It's a very cosmopolitan. St. Petersburg is, I think, is about as westernized as you're going to get. And that still has very strong, well, based on imperialistic foundation. So we have to be realistic with what we can expect from Moscow, from Russia. But I do think that if we were able to get a more moderate, reasonable group of people internationally educated, internationally globalized, or cosmopolitan, then I think you could see at least an end to the desire to want to constantly control the former Soviet republics, right? We have to be tangible about how we go about this, but like interfering in Georgia's elections, interfering in Moldova's elections, in Romania, former Soviet states, that is certainly something that I think we can hope to be a part of and influence. But to sort of see a democratic Russia, I don't know if that's in the Russian mindset.
Chances of even that scenario seem to be diminishing all the time, right? The idea of a technocratic Russian state, a lot of people are praying for Putin's downfall, but what are the odds that someone whoever replaced Putin is actually much more aggressive than Putin, much more nationalistic, much more imperialistic than Putin? I would love to get your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's a chap called, let me just bring up his name. So in 2022, there was a death of a chap called Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who was the leader of the LDP, which for acute Russian watchers will know is the name acronym for Liberal Democratic Party of Russia. Now, why I'm mentioning this is because when Vladimir or Zhirinovsky died, it was a rare occurrence where Putin actually came to his funeral and stood like in front of his coffin, like paying respects or whatever. But the thing is, Zhirinovsky comes from a party which was, supposed to be opposed from United Russia, right? Of course, they're not. It's all part of the same system. The official opposition is not official. It's all a con. But what was interesting is that Zhirinovsky was such a nationalist. He made Putin look like a moderate. Zhirinovsky was such a scary guy. Like, don't get me wrong. I'm not diluting what Putin is or what he stands for. But this guy had the idea. He's sort of like, he's like Dmitry Medvedev, right? Drunken Medvedev with his nuclear threats every other day. He's that level of extremist. So I very much worry about the people that are even more ideologically driven than Putin is. Putin seems to be more ideologically driven than we gave him accountants for, right? In the past, we used to sort of assume he was mainly a pragmatist driven by materialistic value, but clearly his relationship with Ukraine is very ideologically and values based, as he wrote in that July 21 essay. So I worry that, Putin's removed, and so we get an ideologue, someone who's like, we must protect Russia, but we will sort of do so in a grandiose sense of, if we nuke something, that shows we are standing for Russia as, we are reconnecting with the gods of, I don't know, how it's sort of some zealot. I don't know how far this could go, but yeah, there's a lot of people even worse than him, and maybe not an ideologue. Someone like Petrushev, I think he's still head of the FSB, someone who's a lot more sneaky and could undertake covert means of subterfuge even more than Putin does. So yeah, I do worry. I'm not saying I want Putin kept in power, but the problem is it's all well and good to wish for the day after, but do you have a plan for it? If you're going to start a war, if you're going to start a political disposition of someone, how do you ensure that the pathway to something more bearable is there, right? Like when this war with Iran started, clearly the DOW Hegseth did not have a plan for the day after tomorrow. When they undertook the decapitation strategy on March 1st with those airstrikes, well,
they just assumed that the Iranian government would crumble. Yeah. So that you just kick in the door and the whole building falls down, right? Yeah. But
someone else has mentioned Dugin, Alexander Dugin, right? Yeah. He's like a friggin' what's that song with There Lived a Certain Man? Who's the guy who was influencing the Romanovs? His mind, the lunatic.
Rasputin.
Rasputin, yeah. Dugin's like a Rasputin, right? You get some kind of absolute completely blank for a minute. Yeah. I worry about that kind of thing. A sort of Rasputin character. Anyway, so no, it's a great question, and I want I would hope for some kind of coalition of intellectuals who can sort of, as a transitional
That
entity.
is not going to happen. That is not going to happen.
That's why I say I wish for it.
That severity, that power is going to be expressed through violence, and that I mean, Putin has developed such a hold on power, and so much of the authority of the state flows through him, that whoever replaces him is going to need to show that they're in control and that they're exercising that power. And that's going to lead to a lot of severe actions and violence. And there's no other way. There's going to be score settling. There's going to be, I mean, I just don't see that because there's no alternative. In order to have a revolution or a revolt that succeeds, there needs to be some sort of theoretical alternative situation. There is no coalition of intelligentsia ready, waiting in the wings to replace Putin, and no one who supports that theoretical coalition right now. I mean, so what we're going to see is a lot of violence and score settling and backstabbing and palace politics, I think.
No, I think it could go one of two main ways. Let's be realistic, Tim. I agree with you. It's either relatively uninspiring. There is an internal displacement, and the system is largely indifferent. The guy at the front of it is just new. But what perhaps begins to happen more over time is because the system isn't getting better, because the new person who comes in doesn't have anything different to play with, right? His options are shit because the economy's shit. He doesn't have any means to do anything. He's replaced again. And so what you get is this revolving door, which leads to more and more instability. And then you lead to the kind of violence and this turmoil that you're alluding to. So yeah, very, very, and I think, bottom line, I'll pass it back to you for final thoughts, is simply, the economy is now in such a state that the civilian economy is being kept up by the war economy. Putin is in a catch-22. He cannot end the war because it's what keeps the economy going, but he needs to end the war because the economy can't sustain it. And so what breaks first? But
and I think there's the economic side, but also the political side, right? Which is that if he has been held up as a strong man for so long, can he be a strong man with absolute authority if he loses a war against Ukraine?
No.
And is forced to accept unfavorable terms or even humiliating terms as a result of war. I don't think that, this brings us back to one of our original comments on autocracy, which is that they lack the humility to be able to take bad news or bad or even good deals that don't look like they were good deals for them. And that's going to be very difficult to unwind if we want to find some pathway to the future end of this war.
No, certainly. And I would just, I would just simply add that ultimately right now, this is all a phase after what we're primarily focused on, which is an end to the war in Ukraine, because ultimately the war is not going to be decided by the battlefield. Although we've lost a generation of young boys, especially from both countries, or are losing even more. And that's the worst thing about this is the displacement of 10% of Ukraine's population, 20% through asylum, and hopefully people can come back and restore their lives. But a large proportion of eastern Ukraine is uninhabitable for a while because of the amount of mines there and just the military realism of it. But ultimately, this will be decided by what happens in Russia, and ultimately, therefore, we hope that the day zero of Russia's instability and chaos is the day end for Ukraine, and they can go back to restoring and everything. I've just seen on the news actually today that the Europeans have given Armenia access to the European markets, which is a huge step. Tariff-free. Shows you Russia's losing control in the Caucasus, and this is the direction we're going. But anyway, Tim, absolute pleasure. I mean, best part of an hour. I hope people watching have enjoyed that, because I bloody well did. That was absolutely fascinating, and I really hope we could do this more often.
Yeah, I'm really pleased to join you today, and I hope that folks who are watching will check out the Counteroffensive at counteroffensive.news for human interest stories of people resisting authoritarianism based here in Kyiv.
Yes, no, absolutely. For those watching on YouTube, as I said, I'm doing more on Substack. So if you haven't already, go and subscribe to Tim's Substack. Like seriously, if you want human-centric storytelling of the war, the counteroffensive, I've been subscribed for a while now, and it's a very refreshing perspective. And those of you watching,
don't forget the global gambit.
Yes, of course. Yeah, if you like geopolitical analysis and hot-headed debates with people who are idiots, as well as very educational, we've got David Petraeus coming back on in a couple of months, which is exciting, and more military stuff, then you know where to look. But thanks everyone for watching. We'll